I feel a little bit like, the Model T driving up next to, the Porsche that's sitting next to you, because a lot of what we deal with is not dynamic spectrum coordination, but, essentially the point-to-point microwave bands, the bread and butter, and have been for the coordination industry for many years. Comsearch has been in business since 1977, focused on spectrum issues and spectrum needs. And, we've looked at it from the ground up. We're involved in, we were involved in white space, CBRS, the, AFC, you name it. We usually have some involvement in that. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about today is Working Group 3. The NSMA is set up with a bunch of working groups. And when we were, go back to the 90s, when we were set up, or, several years after we were set up, we had probably every one of those groups in the late 80s and 90s active and, producing stuff. We were actually meeting quarterly with conferences because of the issues and everything involved. We've kind of slowed down considerably from there, even before COVID. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit is the focus on Working Group 3, what we do, the purpose. I'm going to give a very high overview on what we're seeing in the microwave bands, point-to-point license bands for the trends. I'm going to throw some data at you because we all have an engineering basis, or at least pretend to be engineers. And, so we always got to have a lot of numbers out there. I want to focus a little bit on a couple of interesting things I pulled out of the Chicago and Dallas areas to give an idea of why it's important what we do here for the licensed point-to-point bands or the Part 101 bands. Real quick, I'll go through the Part 101 basics and where do our recommendations fit in to the Part 101 coordination rules, which is really our focus. The participation in the stakeholders, and then where Working Group 3 is looking for the future focus. So our purpose. Working Group 3 is set up so you have an industry forum. We involve primarily working group NSMA members, but we pull in other industry contacts, government, retirees, you name it. We've got a lot of people involved because we have a good forum and a place to do that. We try to develop an industry consensus on any number of spectrum issues, mostly related to coordination, but we discuss pretty much anything that impacts the microwave users. We develop very specific coordination procedures. If you've read through Part 101, it's a very quick read. It's depending on your font size, it may be a couple pages. And based on that, we're coordinating thousands of microwave paths a year. Well, what we have found over time is that those rules don't cover a lot of circumstances that we as coordinators in the area that I'm focused in a lot of the time, which is a protection agent, to protect the microwave incumbents, they just don't cover it. So over time, we've tried to fill those holes, to interpret, to maintain recommendations, to provide an industry guideline so that we can all be on a level playing field, and everybody from the T-Mobile, the Verizons of the world, and your local school district or the fire department or whoever needs a licensed microwave path can come in and be on that equal footing to get it, and for the same costs. They can put it in cheaply, they can put it in quickly, and really, they don't need deep pockets to do it, which is one of the big issues. We try to help to interpret FCC rules. When the FCC makes changes that impact us, we have a very good group of not only engineers, but attorneys, people that have been involved in this for years They can help interpret and explain that to how does that change me? How does that impact me as a licensee, as an incumbent user? We provide feedback and content for NSMA regulatory filings, which we routinely make as an organization. And we also are open for board action, where they can refer things to us and see if, hey, can Working Group 3 handle this? Is this something we need to start another working group back up? If we needed to look at earth station antennas, or, the terrain loss effect of clutter, whatever it is, we potentially could even start another working group to look at that. So let's look on a high level at microwave trends in the point-to-point microwave. We're seeing much more where there are multiple frequency pairs per link. The norm just a few years ago was, somebody would need a system, they would put in, one channel going one way, one channel going the other way, single polarization. But as we know, everything is driven by capacity. So now they're going to wider bandwidths. They're concatenating channels at 6.1 gigahertz. They're using 80 megahertz channels at 11 gigahertz because, again, capacity is king. They're using XPIC, which essentially allows you to use cross-pole frequencies, the same frequency pair using both V and H polarization on the same path. We're looking at dual band aggregation of channels. Dual band antennas that can operate in both frequency bands on a single antenna. Look at 18 and 80 combinations, 23 gigahertz and 80, or even 6 and 11 gigahertz. So, the ramifications are it's going to get more crowded, and, capacity has gone up. And we've also seen a little bit of a switch where there's a very rapid deployment of paths. We're now getting coordinations for a path, and the next morning, we'll get an STA filed at the FCC to go up on that path because the coordinator, made sure everything was clear and good. And then usually they'll start the licensing process. If they did an expedited PCN, 2 weeks later, they're filing for their license. So, things are happening very rapidly in certain bands and areas. So this is looking at the number of, and again, I'm focused on the point-to-point microwave bands, looking at 6.1, 6.7, 7 gigahertz, 11, 13, 18, and 23 gigahertz. The biggest area, as you can see, the 45% pie piece there is 11 gigahertz. That band usage has exploded in the last 5 to 7 years. 45% based on that band is made up at 11 gigahertz. Now, if you look at the 6 gigahertz, which is the band that, they've now done this underlay below, that's looking at, there's 20% is the 6.1, right below that, 10% is 6.7, and the 4% is the 7 gig. So roughly 34% of the point-to-point microwave bands in the United States right now are in the 6 gigahertz bands. So those together account for, 79% of the actual microwave paths. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. If you go down to the 18 and 23 gigahertz, obviously, the path lengths are shorter, so there's, you're compressing what you can do and how many paths. So obviously, if you're looking at longer paths, longer backhaul, you're going to concentrate on those other bands. But that's a lot of microwave paths. So I've always found that it's nice to see a picture. How does this look? Now, obviously, when you do something for the United States, it spreads out and it gets mucky a little bit, but it's always an interesting exercise anyway. So this is all the licensed, applied, and proposed 23 gigahertz paths in the United States. There's some, singular ones, but you can see they're concentrated in a lot of the populated areas. It doesn't make sense you've got a ton of 23 gigahertz out in the rural areas, just simply, again, because you're talking about relatively or very short paths. Pop into 18, okay? You're talking about a few more paths, a little bit, brighter, map there. You know, they're starting to use them. Even in that corridor, for those of you who aren't familiar, there's a high frequency traders built this corridor the last, how many years? Has it been 7, 8, or 10? 10 years, primarily between New York and Chicago. If you look at there, you can see those lines. That's not some real long paths. That's a bunch of short paths that are trying to get as straight a line as possible between New York and Chicago. Well, let's move up and down in frequency, and you'll see that area will get a little bit clearer. All right, this is 10 and 11 gigahertz. Now, this is primarily the 11 gigahertz bands. But you can see they're, longer paths. They've started to really spread out, occupy more, and there's now a pretty solid line at 11 gigahertz running between New York and Chicago. There's also a secondary line running down from Chicago to Dallas. And again, that's very similar. There were high frequency traders that, were trying to put in, and they didn't like the delays caused by a fiber network on the connections, so they can get faster speed with microwave, and they try to make those paths, as I said, as straight in a line as possible, because they want the distance to be as short as possible. So let's keep going down in spectrum. This is the 6, 6.7, and 7 gigahertz. Now you have a very solid line going from New York to Chicago. And if you look at this, if you drill down on that, you'll see a line of systems, multiple ones, multiple bands, all on that same line. So if you roll all that together, this is what, the U.S. looks at with those, and these are the licensed point-to-point frequencies. They are thickly covered, thickly used, and every one of those went through the Part 101 coordination rules. So that's why it's very critical when we talk about Working Group 3 and when there's an issue, we have multiple coordinators involved in NSMA. And honestly, most of the time, we're the ones that are dealing with this, because most licensees do not coordinate their own systems. So they come to the coordinators, like Comsearch, Micronet, represented by Brad, and others to do that work for them. So a lot of times it's with it's the coordinators talking about where the rules are, and then all the engineers in the meeting, in the room, or the attorneys will get involved, and let's see what we need to do to flesh these rules out. So let's look at Chicago. Now, there wasn't any fancy science here. All I did was, find a good spot kind of in the middle of Chicago, and I drew a 25-mile radius. I said, let's get an idea on what kind of systems we're talking about. So this is all of the microwave paths in the 6.1, 6.7, 11, 18, and 23 gigahertz. So it kind of gives you a feel. It's pretty busy. If you drilled in on the city center, you would see, the paths would become clear. But what I thought was really interesting when you look at this is if you consider Part 101 coordination, every coordinator has their own system on how they do stuff. And that goes down to even the engineers in the individual coordination firms. And every company may have a slightly different idea on what they want to do. Some of them are locked into certain parts of the band or certain frequency ranges because of the equipment they have. Some of them are just wide open. They just need a channel. So when I looked at this, and there's a similar picture we'll get to in just a second in Dallas, but if you look at the spreadsheet, what I had them do was, what are the top 6 channels used in this area? So if you look at, for instance, the 6.1, there are 31 instances of the channel 5945 in that area. All right, so that's not, nobody's bought it at an auction to use it. That's generally probably 31 different distinct paths that are using that same frequency. Now, obviously, for those of you familiar with this, you can start to see the pairs are going to be close in number, obviously. But it kind of gives you a feeling on how the frequency reuse works within the Part 101 coordination rules. And again, going back to that table before, when we talked about the percentage of 11 gigahertz paths, you can see there's 69 paths that are reusing those single frequencies at 11 gigahertz in that area. So it gives you an idea on how well the Part 101 coordination rules work. And they're not all used, because I'm sure the coordinators at Comsearch or Micronet could still squeeze another path on that pair somewhere in there, and they still are, but it does involve more. And let's look at Dallas. Should be the next one. Yeah. Similar numbers. It's the same size space. But what's kind of interesting about this, if you look at the actual frequencies in each of those bands, and the top ones, there's only 3 or 4 of them that repeat across the whole set. So what that is saying is each one is an individual decision based on the area, what the coordinator and everything driving it, the antennas, the location, the towers, etc. But it's an effort by the engineer to fit in a frequency that meets the criteria and works. And it's different area by area. You could do the same thing looking at pulling out New York, LA, or even some of the mountaintops. You would think it would be funny if, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, but there are certain mountaintops or passes that look almost, not quite this bad, but look similar to this, because they're the one place in several 50, 100 miles that they have microwave towers. You can cross those mountains, and they look kind of like this in different bands. So I'm trying to put all this out to say it works. It's not the dynamic spectrum look, okay, but the needs are a little bit different of some of the, putting in a backhaul system and looking at what these companies need. So let's look at the Part 101 basics. Notification, response, and resolution. Sounds pretty easy. What do we need all the rules for? Okay? Even the coordination area, which is the next slide, Brad. And we've got these fairly defined. Most of you have probably seen this. Essentially what it is you have a prescribed distance circular around the transmitter, and you have a keyhole distance that you add to that. So if you look at that image on the screen, it's detailing for the orange path in the middle exactly what the coordination area was. So essentially any other microwave licensee that has a transmitter in that keyhole, and in the circle is who you're going to coordinate with, depending on the band. I think is the only thing that actually changes that. But if on the surface, that's great. Well, like I said, it's dependent on band. Sometimes it depends on who you're sending it to. Are you sending it to the licensee, or are you sending it to a protection agent? When does it change from going to the protection agent to the licensee? All of those things go into how you do the coordination process, and we have NSMA recommendations to back those up. So one thing I wanted to point out on the next slide is, well, how quick can you put in a point-to-point Part 101 microwave path? The question is, if you're in a hurry and everything's in place, you're not building a tower, you can slap your equipment up and your antenna up. Most FCC applications of Part 101 can go up as soon as they're filed, not granted, as soon as they are filed. So if you do an expedited coordination, and generally that's defined as about 15 days, you could, and you have everything else in place, you already have the equipment, you've got space on the tower, you could literally turn that thing up 15 days after you coordinated, with assurance that it's done under a conditional authorization. Again, excuse me, this defines, no waivers, no environmental impact, must be 56.3 kilometers from international borders, cannot be within a 10 gigahertz restricted area, cannot be with 18 gigahertz restricted zones, must be greater than 15 gigahertz in Puerto Rico, and must be specific channels at 23 gigahertz. But essentially, the speed of how quickly you can put one up, excuse me, is very fast if you meet those conditions. So, excuse me, I got to talk too fast. All right. So where do the recommendations fit? So what I did was I took the FCC rule 101.103D, part 1 and 2, which essentially is our coordination rules for point-to-point microwave. And I designated or put in the corresponding working group recommendations that are currently right now posted on the NSMA website. The rule number 1 is general. You know, they give you very broad guidelines. The section 2, the various sections are a little bit more specific. But if you have a question on a specific rule section on where it fits and where the guidelines match up, that's what this is intended to do. You know, so you can see that they really, you know, we essentially are fleshing out the rules. You know, these are, 2 pages, as I said, roughly, if you look at the actual coordination rules. And there's probably, if you throw in the terrain loss and the other ones, there's probably, 500 or maybe 750 pages of recommendation information to try and fill out what the commission started us with. And that's what NSMA is here for. And that's what Working Group 3 does, is try to work through that, try to help all of us be better coordinators. So the participation of the stakeholders, as I said, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Pete. We have an open industry forum. We look at the issues impacting the spectrum industry, and we have a place where issues can be discussed. Current active members include coordinators, spectrum managers, I mean, you name it. Anybody that's involved in spectrum, is involved in Working Group 3. So what's the future focus for Working Group 3? We're going to make a decision on the coordination procedures for ATPC. There needs to be a review of that with the introduction of adaptive modulation, ATPC, and even some of the ACM power coordination things that are going on. We're going to start reviewing that. We've got a few coordination process recommendations that we need to review. Some of them are 2 or 3 decades old. May still be valid. We're going to make that determination, discuss them. We've got recommendations from Working Group 3, 2, 4, 5, and the whole slew of them that we just need to review. Are they current? Are they something that are still valid? They're still usable? Or do we need to archive them? We want to keep active on the recommendations and have good stuff out there for everybody to use. We're also going to talk about temporary earth stations. There's been some issues with those not being coordinated in the 6 gigahertz band, but being used at stadiums, events. We want to look at the experimental STA coordination. It's very inconsistent on how it's done, so we want to see if there's anything we need to put in place to try and improve that process. And we want to look and see if there's any other band sharing things we need to look at from a working group perspective. So that's kind of the focus we're going to go and what we're going to be looking at. And that's it. So you can certainly contact me if you want to be involved in any future Working Group 3 meetings. I'm going to send out an email to everybody currently on the distribution list and have them confirm they want to stay on the list. And then we'll get rolling in June back up with Working Group 3 meetings. So I want to open it up to any questions or...
Coordinate this thing. All right. Do we have any questions for David? Any questions on that? Dr. Willis.
Dave, this is just a comment I wanted to add. So relax, I don't have a question for you. I just wanted to point out just to the audience that when we go through these recommendations, a number of things can happen. We can either decide that, no, this recommendation is still, it's still valid, it's still current, and we'll just basically sign off on it, that this one is still active and fine. It could be that, no, this recommendation is really obsolete now, the rules have changed, or there's something else new in the industry, and this thing is just obsolete, so we're going to retire it and just archive it. I mean, you can always get it back off the website if you want to see what happened in the past, but it's really not active anymore. Or the third thing, which is usually what happens, is we look at these things and say, okay, yeah, this is a valid recommendation, but there's some stuff in here that needs to be updated with current rules and current practices, and that's typically what happens when we review these things. And yeah, just wanted to add that comment, Dave.
The other thing is as George mentioned, when we went through Standard 10, we also, as those go through and the standards are updated, we sync our recommendations up. So that's part of the process as well.
And those maps, that overlay, that dynamic elements of those maps, I bet dollars to donuts that the broadband maps, which say there's no broadband in certain areas, don't correlate. I think we did a filing, as David mentioned, we do filings from time to time, and we did one in the broadband proceeding relatively recently saying, hey world, you could actually talk to us. We can tell you where there's broadband, where you're showing a county that's totally empty. We're coursing multi-gigabits through it, and there's a tower, and the tower has there's a way to link into that, there's a lot of value added, if you're looking, in the future as to where is spectrum being utilized. I don't think we're really overlaying that into the mapping world. And as you saw from David's maps, those are boffo. So they could be utilized for a lot of reasons, and that's just one element of spectrum coordination. The mapping function.